You know, our minds are powerful things, and they can catapult us into dark valleys, sometimes with little warning. You see, the Bible speaks into mental health, and it tells us stories about people like you and I, and how, yes, they went into those dark valleys too, and came out the other end. And Elijah was one of these people. James tells us in James 5:17, he was human, he was just like us. You know, we tend to think of Elijah as being that amazing prophet, but actually he was just like you and me. He suffered burnout, he suffered depression, he suffered from mental health. And mental health is such a complex issue, and we're going to be spending weeks thinking about how there is hope for our mental health and our mental well-being. And it is such a complex issue. There's no one quick fix that we can magic out and know it's just going to solve every problem that we have with our mental health. You know, if we're going to be healthy, there's 4 elements at least to it. You know, there's a physical element, there's the emotional element, there's the relational element, and of course there's the spiritual element, which is so critical. And we can't just fix one of these areas and think everything's going to be sorted, because there's other parts to it, and it's so interconnected and so vital and so complex. But yet in this story of Elijah, which we want to dig into this morning, and you can read about it in 1 Kings 19. I mean, the backstory of this was Elijah was a prophet in the time of Israel, and there'd been no rain for 3 years, and people were far from God in that nation. The king in particular was nowhere near, and the queen. And so Elijah challenged them to this contest, and he said, well, look, okay, let's prove who the one true God is. And we're going to have a sacrifice, and we'll build an altar, and we put an offering on the altar, and you have one for Baal, the god that you're worshipping. I'll have one here to the one and true God. None of us will light any matches, and let's see which God sends down fire from heaven, and then we'll accept he's the one. Okay? And so they did that with the Baal altar. They built it and put the sacrifice on it, and cried out all day, and nothing happened. So Elijah built his altar. He put the sacrifice on it. He even poured water all over it, just to demonstrate his confidence and to show that this was a genuine miracle was going to happen. And he called out to God, and God sent down fire from heaven and burnt up that offering and accepted it. Now you think, wow, what a high Elijah must have been on. That was amazing. What a miracle. And after that, Elijah prayed to God, and God sent rain. And the first time they had decent rain in that land for 3 years. So he was on a high, but also Elijah was exhausted. And when the Queen Jezebel knew all that had taken place and how the prophets of Baal had been destroyed in the process, she got after Elijah, and she threatened to kill him. And so Elijah ran, and he ran away as far as he could. And we sort of catch up with it in the back end of verse 3 of chapter 19. He says when he went away, he said he left his servant there, that's in Bathsheba, and he went on alone into the wilderness, travelling all day. And he says he sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. He said, I've had enough, Lord. I think we've probably all prayed that prayer at some stage, haven't we? I've had enough, Lord. I certainly prayed that prayer when I'm just feeling exhausted, when I'm feeling tired, when I'm feeling frustrated, when things aren't going right, when, you know, perhaps I'm getting criticised or whatever it might be, or just my plans don't work out properly. You know, Lord, I've had enough. We've all been there. I don't think there's anyone that's lived in this planet has never said that prayer at some stage in their lives. But then he went on and he took it further. He said, I've had enough, Lord. He said, take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died. You see, he was feeling suicidal. And I'm aware today that maybe some of you, Elijah's prayer is your prayer. And if that's how you feel today, and life feels bleak, and life feels grim, all the stress of this year and COVID-19 has brought us, and perhaps other pressures upon your life too, if that's your prayer, let me just say from the bottom of my heart, I feel for you. I'm really sorry. You know, life in this planet, life in this world can be so tough. And my heart just goes out to you this morning. You know, one of my nieces, when she hit her teenage years several years ago, her whole life fell apart, and Elijah's prayer was her prayer. And my brother and my sister-in-law and the family, they just didn't know each day when they woke up for months on end whether their daughter, their sister, was going to be alive or dead. It was a heartbreaking time. It affected all the family, as you could imagine. You see, our mental health can be so fragile at times, and what seems sometimes innocuous things can just tip us over the edge, and it just sends everything into spiral and into chaos around us. But this morning, if that's you, I want you to know there is hope. Absolute hope. You see, Elijah shows us how God helped him to move on and to become healthy in all four of those areas: physical, emotional, relational, and spiritual. And it enabled him to get back into good health once again, and so can you. So the first thing I want us to notice here from this passage is that Elijah got some rest, and sometimes we just need to get some rest. You know, it says there in that verse, doesn't it? It says that then he lay down and slept under the broom tree. You see, he's exhausted. God had used him, and amazing things had happened in the nation, and he was on a high. And I know in my experience, when I'm on a bit of a high and great things have happened, I'm physically exhausted, that's when I tend to hit a downer. And that's when I can easily get depressed and get discouraged, or worse. And we need to recognise that, and we need to be kind on ourselves. You know, lockdown affects us deeply, especially in our emotions, and if we're feeling emotional trauma at this time, actually it exhausts us. It is exhausting, and so we need to just accept that we're going to need a bit more rest, and we just got to be kind on ourselves and not feel we've got to push ourselves all the time, because we're not able to. It's emotionally draining, and that in turn makes us physically exhausted. And so we need to be like Elijah and just have a rest. But the second thing he did was interesting. He got some food. You see, in back end of verse 5, it says that, but as he was sleeping, an angel touched him and told him, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there beside his head was some bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. You see, God had sent an angel to provide for him. And I wonder how many times God sends angels to us. I expect it's more than we realise, in all sorts of shapes and forms, to bring encouragement and comfort and direction into our lives. And God sent this angel so that he would get the food he needed. When we're busy, when we're stressed, when we're exhausted, we often don't eat, or don't eat properly. And so he was able to get some food, and he then slept again, and then the angel came back again, and a second time, verse 6 and 7, he got up and he ate a second time, because he had things to do. He needed the energy the food was going to give him. And it reminds us that we need to eat proper food. You know, sometimes when especially when our routines get knocked out of kilter, which lockdown can easily do that. We end up snacking on junk food, and it's not called junk food for a good reason. You know, we actually need to get in proper food into our bodies and to eat in healthy ways and patterns, because it affects our health. And we need to create regular routines which can have rest in there, and healthy eating and exercise. You know, these healthy routines are really good for us, and especially when we're locked in and shut in at home, and our routines can be sent AWOL, it's important to create new routines that will enable us to have that sort of regular process in our lives, which then becomes really helpful and significant for us. Rick Warren says it like this. He says, routine develops resilience. Routine develops resilience. Or predictability creates stability. So actually, it's not being boring to create a routine. Actually, that's really being wise and being healthy. So think through, what is a wise routine. You know, get up at the same time, go to bed at the same time, eat your meals at the same time, have some exercise at certain times in the day, go for a walk, whatever you need to do. You know, have a pattern to your life, have a structure. Even if you haven't got a natural one, create one and hold to it, because that will actually help you to build resilience and stability into your life. But then thirdly, we notice that the place that spiritual food plays in our lives. You know, we need to get some spiritual food. You know, no one else has the power that God has. No one. And so we need all the help we can get. And so we need to invite God into the situation, God into our lives, God to empower us, to enable us to get through this. And so often we tend to sort of put him on the back burner, especially when things go tough, especially when we're facing troubles and problems, and we just tend to withdraw within ourselves. But actually, no, we need God. And so we need to listen for his voice. How do we listen for his voice? Well, the best way to listen to his voice is to get into this book, his word, and to listen to his voice. Because as we read his word, that's the primary way in which he speaks to us today. You know, when Elijah eventually he went on into the wilderness and he came to a cave. And twice God asked him a question. And that question was simply this. He says there in back end of verse 9, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah didn't answer the question properly, so God asked him a second time in the back end of verse 13, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And you know, God asked him these questions, and actually it's interesting to see how it played out, because after the first time that God asked him that question, Elijah replied like this: "I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you, torn down your altars and killed every one of your prophets. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." What did God say to him? "Go out and stand before me on the mountain." And so it says, as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by, and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire there was the sound of a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" You see, God speaks when we're still enough to listen. And I think one of the pluses of our season in which we're living at the moment, this where we're not to be in big groups of people. Actually, it's forcing us to be still and to seek to listen to God's voice. You see, we tend to have a mentality, and that actually it's only when we're together as a big group in church and we sense God's presence and atmosphere, and we have some amazing times, and they are great. And we have they sing the songs and the hymns and have the wonderful times of worship together. And we tend to have this mentality that's the only time we feel God's presence. Actually, as Elijah proved, you know, there was lots of noise. There was a windstorm. There was an earthquake. There was a fire. But it says God wasn't in that. God was in the gentle whisper. And I feel that maybe there's something we need to learn from this during this COVID-19 season, when we're at home primarily and away from most people. That maybe God's just trying to remind us that actually he speaks to us where we are, even here as you're listening to the message this morning. Perhaps tomorrow morning when you're quietly on your own reading something from God's word. He speaks. And it's not an earthquake, it's not a wind, it's not a fire, but it's a gentle whisper. But yet so often in our lives of busyness and rush and coming together in groups that we miss what God is trying to say to us. And we miss the spiritual food that he's trying to nourish us with because we're so focused in other places.